All right, and we are live. Good evening, everybody, or good morning, whatever time it is from where you're joining. Welcome to this product demo. So my name is Christoph. I'll introduce myself in a second. I'll just give this a few more minutes. Feel free to familiarize yourself with Zoom. There's a chat functionality where you can say hi. If you do so, please make sure that you select two panelists and attendees in that blue box. Otherwise, this will only go to Chris and myself. So feel free to say hi. I'll just say hi here. And then this is a small event. So it's really about getting an introduction to Humanitec hands-on, and it's also about your questions. So if you have questions in between, feel free to just put them in this chat or raise your hand, and I'm happy to unmute you so that you can ask directly, because that's what this is all about. It's important for us that you can place your questions and get them answered while getting a hands-on introduction to Humanitec. So I'll give this 1 or 2 more minutes before we start, and then I'll start with an introduction. This demo is being recorded, and we'll share the recording afterwards. Also, everything you see in this demo, you can do with our free trial community version. So if you, after the demo tonight, want to try things yourself, feel free. Just go to our website, humanitec.com, and register for a free trial, and you'll be able to set all this up yourself. Okay, then I'd say let's get started. As I said, my name is Christoph. I'm the COO and co-founder of Humanitec. I'm also responsible for running customer support, and so also responsible for a lot of the onboardings that we do. And I'm here tonight with Chris. Chris is our CTO. Maybe Chris, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so hello everyone, my name is Chris, and I'm CTO here at Humanitec, and I'm looking forward to giving you a tour of how our product works.
Cool. So as I said, if you have questions in between, don't be shy. Raise your hand, put them in the chat, or raise your hand so that I can unmute you. But okay, let's get started, Chris. So maybe to start with a bit more conceptual question. So we are talking about internal developer platforms here, and Humanitec is the fastest way to build your own internal developer platform. But what actually is an internal developer platform?
So a internal developer platform is something which runs inside your organization and is used by your team in order to improve the developer experience. So what do we mean by that? So when building cloud native applications, there's a number of things that developers need to do as part of getting their code actually running in the cloud-based infrastructure, for example, in Kubernetes. They have to obviously write their code, they then have to deploy their code, and then they have to get that code actually running. They have to make sure that is available to them. And as part of this, they'll also want to do things like maybe promote to a new environment. They may want to collaborate with teammates, and so they may want a temporary environment to work in. And eventually you'll want things to be pushed to production. And what an internal developer platform does is allows developers to self-serve most of these things, and also reduces the cognitive load that developers have to try and figure out how to do this themselves. So you can imagine a normal flow might be that developers are sending a Slack message to an ops team to ask to help deploying something into a cluster, or to provision a database, or to spin up a whole new environment. With an internal developer platform, like for example, Humanitec, you can allow developers to self-serve these things, thus meaning the ops team are not acting as a bottleneck to development of applications by the application development team.
Cool. So we have two parties here involved: the DevOps or ops responsible people who set up everything and control everything, are in full charge of the infrastructure, and then the developer. So what are we starting with tonight in the demo?
So we'll start off with our ops hats on. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up some infrastructure inside Humanitec. And then we will switch to our dev hat, and we will then deploy an application into that infrastructure. And we'll also talk about things like creating new environments and associated things. Throughout this demo, let's keep it interactive. If you have any questions, please just write them in the chat, or as Crystal said earlier, raise your hand, and then we'll try and get to you in the kind of flow of what we're doing.
Cool. Then let's get started.
Yeah, so I'll start off. I will share my screen. And here we go. So what you're seeing now is kind of the default experience inside Humanitec. So I just need to arrange my Zoom windows so that I can actually.
It looks good. The shared window looks good.
Yeah, there we go. So this is the default experience. And now as an operations team, what we need to do is we need to set up some infrastructure. So we'll be deploying an application that runs in Kubernetes, and that application will need a Postgres database. So what we'll do is we'll start off by connecting a pre-built or pre-configured cluster that I already set up before this webinar, and then we'll also provision a new Postgres instance using a database as a service supplier. In this case, we're going to use Ivan for that. So let's just have a quick look at what we'll be connecting. So we have a Kubernetes cluster that we already created, creatively called product demo cluster. As you can see, it's already got an ingress controller deployed in it. But what we'll start off with is connected to Humanitec. So
yeah, and I think if you want to follow the steps how to create this and how to create the ingress, our documentation gives you a good overview of how to do this in GKE, EKS, AKS, whatever hyperscaler you're using. But we'll share the link afterwards.
Correct. Okay, so I go ahead and look at organization settings, and I'm going to connect a resource. We have two types of resources in Humanitec. We have dynamic resources and we have static resources. We're actually going to create one of each in this demo. And we'll start off by creating a static resource, and we're going to create a Kubernetes cluster resource. So what is a static resource? So a static resource is a resource that whose life cycle is controlled outside of Humanitec. So you can, for example, a Kubernetes cluster might be a good example because I've already created that. I don't want Humanitec to do anything with it, so I don't want it to like close it down when I'm finished with it. I want to manage all of that myself. So I'm going to create this as a static resource. So what I do here is first I choose a name. So let's call it, what did we say it was called? Product demo cluster. And we can choose a driver. So as Christopher already mentioned, we have support for AKS, which is Azure, EKS, which is Elastic Kubernetes Service, which is on AWS, and GKE. We're going to use GKE for now. So we can select that. And basically what we need to do now is we need to populate this small form. So we have the name of our cluster, which was a product demo cluster. We also need to add the load balancer, which is generated from the ingress. We can just drop that in here. And we also need to have our GCP project ID, which is our Humanitec demo account. We need to let it know what zone this cluster is running in. And then finally, we need to provide some credentials, which is what Humanitec will use to connect to the cluster. So I will just drop that in here. And that is pretty much all we have to do. And now we have this connected up. What I want to do is I want to associate this cluster to a group of environments that we're going to create. So I'm going to add this to our environments of type development. So you can imagine like you have multiple development environments. You might have a load of staging environments. You might have a load of production environments. But we want to use this product demo cluster on a development environment. So we'll add that over here. So that's our Kubernetes cluster connected. let's go ahead and add a dynamic resource now, which is going to be a Postgres that is provided through Ivan. So when we talk about Postgres database, we're going to talk about creating the database inside an already existing Postgres instance. So it is dynamic in the sense that Humanitec will create the database inside the Postgres instance, and then will tear down the database once the environment is no longer used. So it is dynamic in the sense that Humanitec is controlling the life cycle of the database resource. Now, in order to do this, we actually do need to create a Postgres instance. So I'm going to go ahead to my Ivan console. I'm going to create a new service over here. We'll choose Postgres. Let's put it in Belgium. That sounds like a great place to put it. And to save money, I will choose the smallest one we possibly have. And I'm also going to choose a name here, Humanitec product demo. Seems like a good name. Let's create that service. And just as before, we need to fill in a form over here. So I can go and say I want to create a Postgres resource definition. I'm going to choose the driver. In this case, it's our generic relational database management system driver. Let's have it as demo Postgres. And again, we need to fill in a form here. So we need to go over here. This is my database I was creating. And conveniently, everything is on one page in Ivan, so that's great. We just need to fill in the bits and pieces. So the first thing is we need the hostname or IP of the instance, which is over here. I'll just copy that across. Next thing we need is the management database name. So the database you connect to as the management user, and that is this one here. So let's drop that one in here, and the port that the database is available on, which is over here. Let's drop them there, and then we need to provide a username and password. Let's start off with the password, which is here, and the user that we are using, which is this one here. Okay, so that is all of the details we need, and that will then allow Humanitec to connect to the database using these credentials, create new databases inside that Postgres instance for the running application.
So that's the admin user for the entire instance that is then allowed to create individual databases and users and everything else that's needed.
Exactly. And once again, we want to connect that to our development environment types or development environment types. Okay, so that is our kind of ops setup. That's what we need to do to get ourselves going inside Humanitec. So we're going to change hats now, and we're going to switch modes into developer modes. So what we're going to do now is we're going to pretend to be developers, and we're going to deploy an application using Humanitec into the infrastructure that we've just set up. So I'm just going to show you a quick schematic of what we're doing. Basically, we're going to have a 2-container application. We're going to have one container which serves a web front end. So in this case, it's a React application. It doesn't really matter. But that will be available on a DNS name. It then makes requests inside the cluster to a backend service, and the backend service talks to a Postgres database. The important thing is that the front end and the back end are both running inside the cluster, and the Postgres database is running as a service. In this case, it's running in Ivan, and this cluster is that GKE cluster that we just created before. So that's our kind of target state. So in order to get this kind of up and running, we can go ahead and create an application. So an application in Humanitec is basically a collection of services that run in the same namespace. You might want to call these a project. You might want to call them namespaces, whatever you want. We just use the term application, but kind of it maps to whatever terminology you use inside your own organizations. So let's go for product demo app. Why not? Okay, so this is the kind of default view. What we have here is our starting situation. So you can add workloads over here. So a workload is in the Kubernetes terminal workload, like a deployment, stateful stats, cron job, whatever it is that you're actually running in your cluster. and we have a particular environment selected. So at the moment, we have a environment of name development and of type development, kind of a bit confusing, I guess, they both kind of have the same name. And we have a draft deployment. So a draft deployment is how we propose changes to go into the environment. At the moment, there's nothing there, so we should probably add something. We can create a new workload, and by default, we can create a standard Kubernetes deployment based off an image. So we've another thing we've done in the background is we have pushed a load of images to a registry, and those images are then registered with Humanitec. So I might just jump and show you that very quickly. So over here we have our images, and we have a GitHub connection, and you can see on the 20th of April, I pushed 2 images into the platform, and in this case, these are these 2 here, and that corresponds to this Git repository that you're looking at over here. So those are now available to Humanitec, and basically this provides a load of metadata about the images, like where they're stored, what commit they were built with, and so on. So these are kind of useful things, and you'll see that later on in the demo. So anyway, we have these images. I can go and select them now from here. So we have products app, which is our front end. Let's create that. And we have product service, which is our backend. We can go ahead and create that. So if you remember from the diagram, we have a few things. This the front end service needs to be exposed publicly, so we need to somehow provision a DNS name, and it also needs to find the backend service here. So those are the 2 things we need to do. We can go and configure our workloads by clicking Edit Workload. And the first thing I may want to do is provision a DNS name. So out of the box, Humanitec comes with a quick way to provision DNS names. The way we do that is we say we need a DNS name, and we can do that by adding an external resource. So I can choose DNS over here. And what that does is it says, when we deploy this, Humanitec, please can you go and provision a DNS name for me so that I can be accessible to the outside world. So once we have our DNS set up, we can then add a DNS resource. And in this case, I just want to route everything that comes on that DNS name to port 8080. So you can see here, this DNS here, which is this DNS ID up here, everything will be routed to port 8080, which is fantastic. And then we also need to tell this front end service where its backend is in the cluster. And I have a very badly named key. This is a copy and paste of like really multiple layers of repositories. So it's called public server URL. It really needs product server URL. But apologies for that spelling mistake. I hope it still makes sense. And basically, I can just create a URL here. And what we can do is we can reference the other workloads within here. So we have the module that we're talking about, which is also workload. We're currently transitioning from the terminology module to terminology workload. And I have my backend service here, and I want to connect to the in-cluster name of that service. And I also want to talk to it on port 8080. So at deployment time, what Humanitec will do is it'll go and provision a DNS. It'll set up the ingress for us, and then it'll replace this with the name of the other workload running inside the cluster, and drop it in this environment variable by creating a config map and then linking that up to the running pod. So that's our front end done. Now let's jump into the back end. If you remember from my little diagram here, the backend service has a dependency on a Postgres database. So much in the same way that we configured DNS, we can go and we can add a Postgres dependency here. I'm going to give it a different name, make it easier to spot this later. So I've created a Postgres database with the ID mydb. We haven't created anything in the real world yet. All we've done is said that there's a dependency on a Postgres database for this workload. So that's great, but if this database is going to be dynamically generated, I need to be able to tell this workload how to connect to the database. So the standard way of doing that is with a connection string. So we have an environment variable called connection string, and we can just create that right here. So in much the same way that we could reference different modules, here I'm connecting to this external resource, external because it's outside of the cluster. And it's the MyDB, and I'm going to have the username. And then I'm also going to have password. And then, then I'm going to have, oh, my hand keeps jumping the mouse around on the trackpad. The host, and then the port, and finally the database name. So if you remember earlier on when we filled in that form, we provided the host and the port, but the username, password, and database name are actually going to be generated by Humanitec and then injected at deployment time to create the final connection string. So that is all the configuration I need to do, I think, to get all of this up and running. So now that we have all of the stuff in our draft that we want to propose for deployment into the environment, I can go ahead and do deployment. So here we get a quick summary of the changes. The changes are not particularly exciting right now because we're just adding to workloads. We'll see how when we make more fine-grained changes, how you'll get a more detailed report about what has actually changed inside. But we're saying here that we have our comment, first deployment, so we can track what we've actually been doing. And I'll go ahead and deploy. So what's happening here is that Humanitec has taken all of the configuration put together, and it's then going to go off and provision this DNS name. It's going to go and provision the database in that instance in Ivan. It's then going to generate a set of manifests, which will include, for example, the ingress definition that we have, config maps for those two environment variables we created, and also then the in-cluster deployment resources. And then it's going to connect to the cluster and actually deploy those into the cluster itself. So while we wait for the pods to wake up, so it looks like the product service has already woken up, and now the products app has woken up, we now have a running service in our cluster. So actually, let's go ahead and look at this. If you remember, this was the view we had before. If I refresh this, we should now see, in addition, that we have our products app, and product service, Kubernetes deployments running inside the cluster, which is fantastic. So let's just kind of jump in. We said we provisioned the DNS name. Let's go ahead here, and we can see that the ingress, that placeholder we had previously, is expanded now to a highly memorable name. Let's go and look at that. And what we have now is an application. And if I put something in, this is that front end we talked about. This will now send a message to the back end. The back end will still send me a database and then read it all back. So this is one round trip that's gone through all of those services and come all the way back. So what we can see here is we have logs that have come directly from Kubernetes. So as a developer, I get immediate access to logs for what I'm doing. I also have a summary of all of the configuration that I set up in here, including the full image that I'm connected to. So you can see here we have a get to the products API, a post to the products API, and another get. So that's kind of the round trip. If we switch workloads to the backend service, we can see here that we have, I've actually outputted the connection string, which is not really a kind of ideal situation, but it's good for our demo because it allows us to see what's happened. So you can see here we have our templated string, and Humanitec has filled in these gaps for us. So we have a user. We have a user here, which has been auto-generated, a password, which has also been auto-generated. But then this is, I don't know how good your memory is, but that is the Postgres instance that we had set up in Ivan. And this is the port number that was set up in Ivan. The database name has also been auto-generated by Humanitec. And again, we can see the logs. We have those requests. So this is the request from the front end. It was a get to the list of products, post to the product, and then another get to the list of products. So that is kind of the initial setup and running of an application. Take a quick pause here and ask if anyone has any questions that they want to cover. If not, I will continue on with the next bit. Okay, no questions, in which case, let's move on. So let's say we want to make some kind of change. So we've got something set up. Maybe I want to make an update to some kind of configuration change. Let's say that I want to go and update the product service. I want to enable cool feature. I'll set that to true. There isn't actually, this won't actually do anything, but I just want to add some configuration change to this configuration. So I can go and say, okay, that is a change I want to make, and now I want to go and deploy it. So I want Humanitec to go and update the config map, add that in so that I then have a new environment variable running in my pod in the cluster. So I can go ahead and deploy that change. And what we can see here is the more detailed diff that I was talking about a bit earlier. So you can see that in the product service workload under the container product service, there is a new variable called enable cool feature set to true that has been added. So let's say enable cool feature. We go ahead and deploy that. So once again, Humanitec will make sure we have everything provisioned. It's not going to recreate the external resources like the DNS and the database. If they already exist, it's just going to say, great, we already have something, let's carry on. But it will, of course, recreate the config maps for the product service. You also notice that only the product service went offline briefly because that was the only one that's actually being updated. So the product app wasn't updated because nothing changed in there. Yeah, there we have everything up and running. What you can see now is you can see we have, again, a draft available to us to propose new changes. We have the current active deployment, which is running, and we also have the past deployment. So if I compare, for example, the current running deployment, I can look in here, and I can see that we have this environment variable. And then I can go back and look at our initial deployment, and I can see the configuration here, and I can see, I only have one environment variable. I do not have this new flag. But Humanitec provides you with other ways of kind of figuring out what has changed. So I can also, for example, do a diff between this and the previous deployment. And we can see here the difference between the current deployment and the first deployment is that effectively, because we're going kind of back in time, the difference is that we remove the environment variable if we look back in time from now to what was there before. So this is very useful for kind of introspecting and analyzing what has changed within your configuration. And you can imagine how this would be very useful for tracking down where bugs were changed and spotting a kind of hard to spot difference in some configuration. So at the moment, we've been doing everything in one environment. We've had our development environment, but let's say we wanted to collaborate on a feature. So let's say I was working with a front-end engineer, and we want to create a copy of what we currently have in our shared development environment, but we're going to break stuff, so we want it isolated from everyone else so we don't disrupt the rest of our team. So in Humanitec, that's very easy to do. I can go and clone this a deployment to another environment. So for example, we have a current active deployment. Maybe I want to take, I don't want this cool new feature. I want what we had 5 minutes ago. So I can go ahead and clone this deployment to a new environment. And maybe I want to call this a feature test environment, and the type of environment is still going to be development. So I will go and create this. And what you can see here is that we have our draft, but the what's deployed in the what's going to be deployed in the environment is actually a clone of what is in the development environment. So if I don't make any changes and just deploy that, what I should get is an exact copy of what was in the development environment, but we will provision new resources. So we should get a new DNS name. We should get a new database set up in that Ivan instance, and so on. So actually, we can probably watch that happen in real time. So if we go here and look at the databases that we have in Ivan at the moment, this is the database that was created for the first environment. And then once this deployment is finished, we should then have an additional database available here. Maybe I need to refresh. We can go here. We have 2 databases now. So the second environment has created a second database. And if we go and inspect our project app, we can see that we have a different DNS name. So if you remember, our first one started with a B, and this one starts with a P. And to kind of prove the point, I open this up, and I think the thing back end is probably still waking up. Yeah, it hasn't woken up yet. I was a bit too eager. I'm going to wait for everything to actually start up before we can connect up. But once it has started up, then we'll be able to see that we'll be in an empty database without actually anything, any data already in it. And the 2 environments will then run independently from each other. And if we look in our Kubernetes cluster, we should now see that we have an additional set of services. So we can see we have a second namespace that's been created. We have the service which is still waiting to have availability. But we have the first services that we have running here. Those are already running. So I hope we haven't used up all the resources in our cluster yet. That could actually be what's going on. An undersized cluster for the demo. Anyway, we have kind of these 2 bits and pieces here. Now, you may remember when we were talking earlier with our ops hat on about different environment types, and we added our resources to the environment type development. So you can see here, this small text that's under here is representing the type of the environment. So these are both environments of type development, but we have 2 environments of type development. And if we go back to our resources, you can remember that we set up our product demo cluster to target the development environment, and we set up our demo Postgres, also targeting the development environment. So I think this deployment does look very unhappy. And I think it is probably the fact that I created way too small a cluster, and we've actually blown through our resources. And it's probably
you were trying to save too much money.
Yeah. Mental note for the next demo. But anyway, we can actually use this maybe to also show how we can clean up after ourselves. So let's say we've done and we've worked in this environment. I can go ahead and delete it. And the great thing about Humanitec is that these environments are very easy to set up, but also very easy to tear down. So once we've deleted the environment, Humanitec will then go ahead and within a couple of minutes, we'll have cleaned up all of the resources that are associated with that environment. So what we should see is, for example, the workloads will slowly disappear. You can see this one is now terminating. And so we should have be back to just having 1 additional namespace. And we should also see, there we go, already the second database has been cleared out of the Ivan instance that we had set up. And then we're back to our single environment. So this is a very useful feature because it allows for temporary or ephemeral or preview environments, whatever you want to use as a terminology, to be spun up. You can imagine setting this up obviously for things like collaborating with developers, but you can also think about creating a new environment on a pull request, for example, so that the person reviewing the pull request can actually see the code running live in an environment. And you can also imagine spinning up environments as part of a, for example, a testing pipeline. So your QA test could actually set up a full environment, run all the tests in it, and then tear down the environment afterwards in a very easy kind of direct way. Now, everything you can see in the UI is also available via an API, which is documented at api.docs.humanitec.com. And so you can find all of the various bits and pieces we talked about. So you can find out how to create your dynamic resource definitions, static resource definitions like we had before. But you can also find out how to create deployments and kind of do all of that analysis that we were talking about regarding diffing what is running in various environments and so on. So this makes it very easy to integrate into, for example, a CI pipeline, or to add it into some kind of automated testing that you're already running. So I think that was all of the things I wanted to cover in the demo. Any questions at this point that people want to ask?
Yeah, if you have questions, just either type them in the chat, or you can also raise your hand, and I'm happy to allow you to unmute your mic, whatever you're up to.
So we have a quiet audience today.
It's fine. So let me ask one question that I'm getting quite a bit. So you showed us these namespaces in your Kubernetes cluster. Can I actually, where can I see them in Humanitec? Where's this link to the namespace that was created?
Mm-hmm. So as we mentioned before, every an application in Humanitec is basically a collection of services that run in the same namespace. Now, an environment is effectively an instance of an application, so it's also an instance of a Kubernetes namespace. So if we look at the environment settings over here, we have the namespace that's generated right here. What we can also do is we can also change this. So I may, for example, want to change this to fancy new namespace, for example. So I can create any valid Kubernetes namespace in here, and then it will, and then Humanitec will automatically delete the old namespace and then recreate everything in the new namespace for you. You could also set the namespace before you did your first deployment, and then always create the namespace based on what you choose. In order to support kind of the full preview environment and dynamic environment creation, we always generate these things automatically. A lot of the stuff you see, like the generated database names and so on, can be changed, but these are all done. The default's are always there so that you get a genuine name that is also not going to clash with anything else that's running in your cluster.
Cool. That's the connection.
Yeah. So I think we just got a question from Chris. So hi, Chris. He asks, does Humanitec provide tools to create, for example, source code, the product services? So the short answer to that is no. How we see ourselves fitting into the process is the developer codes in their IDE. So whether that's Visual Studio or IntelliJ or whatever your favorite IDE is, and then you merge and push with Git, and then run some kind of CI pipeline, and you actually do the running or the deployment of the application with Humanitec. So we're kind of the third step in the process. So we actually are completely unopinionated about what tooling you're using. You could be writing in Java, you could be writing .NET code, you could be writing Node.js code, whatever you want. We don't care. As long as you generate a container image that is then runnable in a Kubernetes cluster, everything is fine as far as Humanitec is concerned.
Yeah, and then I mean, in the example that you showed today, the repository and the pipeline was already connected so that we could use the image directly. But this is a very easy process, also described in our documentation on how to connect CI pipelines to Humanitec. I think in the GitHub example, it's just one workflow, right? Where you exactly. Yeah.
So this is the magic that builds and runs the notification of Humanitec as kind of one step. If you already have a fully developed pipeline, you can just do the notification step yourself. That's all in the documentation.
Yeah. If you have your own registry up and running, no need to push the image somewhere else than your own registry.
Yeah. So for example, you can look at that here in connecting CI pipelines. There's a kind of brief description, and then we have some guides for all the different types of pipelines you might connect. And you can also then integrate with whatever else. We just provide the raw curl commands that you can use directly. And even if you want to just play around, there's even a fully working bash script that you can just use to do that push without even having to set up a CI pipeline for yourself.
So you push from your local Docker registry on your machine. Cool. So maybe, so first of all, thanks, Chris, for giving us this hands-on introduction to Humanitec and wiring everything up. Always great to see the first steps. As I said in the beginning, everything you saw today, you can try yourself. Just head over to humanitec.com and register for a free trial. If you need support in getting started, we'll send an email tomorrow to all of you with a link to the recording and also some useful links, and just feel free to hit reply for that email, and we're happy to help you get started with Humanitec, answer more questions, probably around other resources than Ivan databases, because this is just an example. Obviously, you can integrate Humanitec with a lot of other resources. Just listened into the community webinar with Elasticsearch yesterday, with an interesting discussion on how to do this with Elasticsearch. That doesn't have a clear namespace concept and a clear concept on how to separate between different environments. So Ivan databases or databases in general are definitely not the only thing you can run using Humanitec. Thanks for joining tonight. Have a great evening or rest of the day from wherever you joined, and hopefully see you in the free trial of Humanitec soon. Take care.
See you later. Bye.